Hi, and welcome back. I'm Walter with Flight Path Pioneers. This is a helicopter lesson in 15 minutes. And again, as a quick reminder, I'm a CFII with about 200 hours. I do this as part of my See One, Do One, Teach One series. This is how I'll become a better teacher, so I'm not perfect. If you have any comments, please leave them. Be constructive, be informative, or ask a question. I'd be happy to follow up on that. Together, we can grow and provide safe flight to many pilots into the future. In the first part of the advanced aerodynamics, we talked about hovering and some of the principles behind it. So please go back to that if you have not done so. It's sort of in sequence here. The next portion of it will be more focused around in ground, out of ground, and other tendencies when we start going into our hover before we go into the next segment after that, which will be called forward flight. So I hope you're enjoying it. And again, I'm always open for feedback and comments to see how we can make better videos in the future. So hovering in flight, we're talking really about induced flow. So the first thing that we need to remember that when we have an engine that is running with rotors that are counterclockwise spinning, it's pulling air from the top down through the rotors to the bottom. And why is that important? Because we have to understand the flow of air as it accelerates through the rotor blade system. All that air on the bottom, downward, has to go somewhere. And that is very different when you are in hovering while sitting on the ground or within ground effect, or if you're hovering out of ground effect. And it even differs when you're flying over grass, over blacktop, or water. And all of these things are very important because it requires a certain amount of power, and there's an infinite amount. There's not an infinite amount of power. Right? We have limitations. That also gives us limitations to what it is that we can do or where and when we can hover safely. So we have to think about the induced flow, right, will be at the greatest at a hover itself. Because there's no horizontal airflow, right? It's all straight down through the rotor itself as we're sitting on the ground first, as we're creating lift. And then when we go forward flight, things change. And we'll talk about what changes and how does that impact the flying. So again, as we pull collective, right, and we need to keep that nose from wandering to the right, right? We use our anti-torque pedal, the left pedal for that. We also increasing the pitch of the blade, so it takes more bite out of the advancing blade on the right side, takes more. That is helping us create lift, but it also the forces, the downward wash of the will become more significant. So it's actually displacing in air, and as the air goes through the blade itself, it accelerates. And what happens with that? That can benefit us, but also can work against us. So the first thing we're going to be looking at is in-ground effect. And again, the picture next to us illustrates that to show you using the arrows on where the airflow, the induced airflow from the top to the bottom and what happens at that point in time. So in-ground effect is usually in the length of one rotor, so 10 to 15 feet approximately. So when we're practicing hovering, we stay within ground effect because it takes the least amount of power, right? And again, this is sitting stationary in one spot, not moving forward, right? So all of these forces are as we are in the stationary position itself. It is the flow that comes through the blade that is accelerated and then hits the ground. And if you think about that, because the distance between the blade and the ground is only, what I would say, about 10 to 15 feet, all of that air gets compressed and it kind of sort of backs up, making it that much easier for the aircraft to generate lift itself and remain in a hover. So in other words, it takes less power on the engine to be in a hover. Now, this is on a solid surface like blacktop or concrete. Now, if you make this grass, especially high grass, or water, it becomes much more difficult to hold a hover in ground effect. And actually some interesting videos of helicopters that came into a hover over water in ground effect and just did not have enough power, ended up sinking right into the water itself. So you always have to be aware of that where am I landing? What is the surface like? Is it grass? Is it gravel? Is it stone? Is it concrete? Is it blacktop? Is it water? Because the power setting is something you will calculate as part of your pre-flight to see if you have enough power available for the circumstances, for the environment, right? Temperature, density, altitude, relative humidity. All these things have an impact on our ability to generate lift. So again, in-ground effect makes it easier, right, to maintain a hover on a hard surface. Now you see the wingtip vortices are taking very little space up on the blade itself, so we have the maximum amount of blade available to generate lift. That's a good thing. Now, of course, that changes when we're going out of ground effect. So we're above that one diameter, let's say 15 feet or so above the ground. Now the air, as the helicopter elevates into the air itself, this air is no longer compressed on the bottom. The wingtip vortices are now have the ability to generate and to its fullest extent, and takes up more space on the wingtips of the blade itself, reducing the total, the total square of the lifting surface of the blade itself. We talked about that in the lifting coefficient, right? And if you have less surface to help you lift, it requires more power to maintain that. Now again, we only have so much power available to us, right? We cannot overpitch, because if we overpitch, right, then we can cause actually rotor RPM decrease, which will be detrimental. Now we practice these things as we go flying to kind of see what the impact is. And one of the things that we were doing in flight is doing a hover auto. So you go between that 8 and 10 feet within ground effect itself, and now you reduce the RPM setting, in other words, power to the rotor, and now you have to manage that energy, that little energy and altitude you have left, in order to settle down as soon as possible. Now, in-ground effect and out-of-ground effect will be very different from each other, right? And it is, you will practice this in-ground effect, you will not be practicing this out-of-ground effect, right? There will be a slightly different way of doing that as you learn how to do auto rotations. But again, think about these forces are real, and we have to take these into account. And we have to test if a helicopter has the power available and out of ground. So if you're going to photo flight, for example, and you are hovering at 1,000 feet AGL, and it's a hot summer day, you want to test to see if you have enough power to be able to stay in a stationary position. If not, you could get yourself into troubles, right? And we'll talk about what kind of troubles sometime in the future. I don't want to go into it right now. All right, next thing we do, of course, after we have gone from in-ground effect to out-of-ground effect, we want to start adding, forward or sideways or backwards motion to that. And we have to think about this, that anytime we change direction, and that's the beautiful thing about flying helicopters, you can change direction from a hover, left, right, forward, backwards, with minimal input of the cyclic alone, right? Again, the collective is to hold the height of the hover itself. The cyclic will allow you to go left, side, forward, or backwards. And these things, again, changes of the forces that are taking place when you add thrust into the direction itself. And these things will need to be, you take into account. Again, we're trying to find an equilibrium of the aircraft itself to perform at a point that we are able to maintain a hover, right? We don't sink into it. And that will create safe. So in this particular, in each of these scenarios that you see here above, is the rotor disc tilts in the direction of the movement itself, taking a portion of that thrust and utilizing it for lateral movement itself, right? The helicopter is using the energy in two directions now, so it may require more power than it's stationary. And again, that's the key word here, is more power. And your question is, do I have that power available to complete this? Now, most of the time, if you're able to lift off and go into in-ground, out-of-ground effect, your weight is less than the lift component. So if you make small movements to the left, right, forward, or backwards, you should be able to do that without going to max power itself. If you're being super aggressive, then obviously you can, and that's something that is strongly discouraged unless you have the experience to do that, right? Everything early on in flight is small movements, right? Build competency, really get an understanding what the aircraft is like before you go into more advanced procedures. The pendular action, and this will be, trust me, the one thing that will frustrate you. So you will come in with your instructor and you go to a local airport and he or she will guide you down by changing the collective and cyclic settings as you come from forward flight into a hover. Now, being in a hover over a spot, let's say on the numbers of a runway, it looks and it sounds like so simple, right? But what happens is often as we come in, we start making corrections, and we end up getting this pendular swing taking place. And the reason why that is that when you start moving to the left, you have the tendency to take the cyclic and move it to the right. And that's exactly what the aircraft does, right? It goes to the left, now you're telling it to the right. So it will swing to from left to neutral, back to the right. But now you go to the right, now you yank the cyclic to the left and you go back. And next thing you know, you go in this pendular motion. And now remember, this left and right, forward and backward, it can all happen at the same time. That becomes not only nauseating, but at some point in time it becomes, you feel like you're out of control. Now, that is absolutely normal when you first start flying. So I wish that I had learned, although I have no complaints. I got this, I figured out how to hover by hour number 6. You can go to my video bank. I think I started videotaping all of my flights by hour number 6 or 7. I really wish that I would have covered the first few hours as well, but that, of course, I can't go back and do that. But I learned early on that somebody said, listen, instead of flying with a whole hand, a death grip on it, right? Hold it with just 2 fingers, index finger and your thumb. Always make sure that you rest your arm on your leg itself. And the next thing to do is to pretend that you have nothing else but maybe a Snapple bottle, which is a pretty wide neck, right, opening, that you can move the cyclic. So practice at home to do nothing else but small little movements, not left, not right, forward and backwards, small. And the other thing is that when you go left, don't go right and stay right, because now you're telling the rotor head to go right. Right? So if you go left, neutral, right, neutral. If you go the opposite direction, left, back to neutral. And it is really, and you'll see that your instructor, when you start making the big swings, he or she will grab the cyclic strong and hold it in the middle, because as soon as you give the input to the rotor head to not do anything anymore, to stay stationary, it will wobble until it gets back to that. Now, if it gets out of control, what you see the instructor do, they take over, say, I got the aircraft, and you fly away from it. You go forward flight, and that's how you can stabilize and try again the next time. Again, don't get discouraged by this, because this is something we all have to go through. And of course, on windy days, it makes it a little bit more harder. So here are some of the helpful tips on that, right? With all of the aerodynamic forces acting up on the helicopter, it's easy to lose control during a hover. Right? That's the easiest time to lose control. The key is to be patient. Nice, smooth pickups and set downs will come with time and practice. So you do not need to be perfect in the first 10 or 20 hours. But as you learn to feel the aircraft, and listen, I have 200 hours, I can have some really good days. You have pickups and set downs. It's like setting it down on a cushion. And other days you're flying into the ground, or you have these ugly pickups, you wobble, right? But the best advice to give is this, is that keep your eyes outside in the distance. Don't look down to the skids. Eyes outside, right? Allow your body to stabilize, and the sensing from a distance is smaller than if you look at it forward where things are bigger. Right? That's the reason why you look forward and outward. Same thing as when you're straight level flight, you want to look at the horizon. You don't even need the artificial horizon attitude indicator inside the aircraft, right? To be able to see if you're flying straight and level. And you want to anticipate some of the corrections. Right? So if you know that you have a right tendency as you start lifting off, well, it will make slight corrections to the left. Right? If you know that you add power, that you're going to have a nose wants to go to the right, well, you add a little left pedal. Right? And all these things, as time progresses, you will get better and better at this. but pay close attention to it. And sometimes is seeing one, right? Asking your instructor to do it while you hold really light pressure on the controls. You might feel it and catch onto that quicker itself. The other thing you can do is to go home, put in a can of peas, empty it out first. Hold a wooden spoon in your index finger and thumb. Hold them in between your legs, and don't allow yourself to go any further than that. Right, so you're building up muscle memory to take appropriate action on that. Okay. The next thing is rollover, and that is something that we always have to think about, especially when we are landing or we are in stationary underground or we're starting to take off again. Is that where and how did we park? Now, there are a couple different ways of doing that. We're getting ourselves into trouble. Is we have a static and dynamic rollover, right? When a static is when we have the center of gravity of the helicopter goes outside of the skid. So if a skid is, it can be stuck, or we are rolling it and the center of gravity goes outside of the skid itself, we can have an accidental rollover. Now you have many ways of it can help you with that, but again, be mindful of that. It's a lesser of the two that could happen, but again, smooth movements will prevent that from happening. It is the dynamic rollover, right, where we have a pivot point that is other than the center of gravity, that the thrust is greater than the weight, and a rolling movement of 15 degrees, right, on a 5 to 8 degree slope is rolling us over. And that is the thing to keep in mind, is that when we have sloped landings, and you'll learn that, right, there's a very specific way to take off from that. Landing on a softer surface, you could actually have one of the skids get stuck, or in the wintertime when you land somewhere on snow or ice, one of the skids could actually get stuck and be frozen. So you use more force. Well, that force, once it lets go, can cause a dynamic rollover, right? These are some of the most critical situations that you can get into, and it is really, something you have to be able to, you have to think about, right? Especially when you have the right skid is low, because we already know that we have a translating tendency to the right. So as soon as you start picking up and your left comes up first, you have that, again, be mindful of that, right? Especially when we have crosswind components to play as well. Again, so don't do this on your own, unless you really have to. Right? The beautiful thing about the helicopters is we can park it just about anywhere. So if you can find a level spot, find a level spot. If you can land it and put the nose into the wind, put the nose into the wind. Right? These are weights to mitigate. Your instructor will teach you as you start flying to test out the ground you're landing on before you're actually putting full weight on it. Leah Coates, who's a great person to find on YouTube and Instagram, she does a lot of flying in Alaska and other parts of the country and lands on top of mountains. She has some great examples on how she is testing out her skid stability before she ever puts the aircraft down with full weight, right? Both when she lands, but also when she takes off, to exactly prevent this from taking place. The last part of that is the gyroscopic precession. And we have learned this probably in high school, is that an input in a rotating force is in the spinning object is felt at 90 degrees later. Now, when we looked at the components, we learned that the rotor head is offset by 90 degrees. So literally, your cyclic forward means that there is an input at the 3 o'clock, so the output is actually felt when we're going forward, right? So, for instance, here as an example is that the pitch angle change made at 3 o'clock will be felt at the 9 o'clock with a counterclockwise system. Right, so we have to think about that and how that all works. And of course, that's not an issue because the pitch change horn is angled at 9. So that's the pitch horn. Again, go back to the components lesson to see what that looks like. Or get on the ladder, look at the rotor mass, look at all the pitch links and the pitch horn that is offset by 90 degrees, so it all makes sense to you, right? That takes into account the gyroscopic precession. You know and understand that because you might be asked questions about that on your test itself. All right, this is the end of that. We're going to go to forward flight next. I hope you enjoyed it and got something out of it. If you have any questions, let me know. And much success learning how to hover. Once you get it, you'll love it.